right, you brave and happy few. You're here to hear about that David. It's Advent, which means we talk about David a bunch. Because, why? Why would we talk about David a lot in Advent? J-Man is why. Jesus is the reason for the season. Yes, all the time, everybody. Oh man, like I need a mic. Go team. Okay. So, we're hearing a lot about David today because one of the things that is said about Jesus, before Jesus, while Jesus is around, and after Jesus is around and resurrected, is constant conversation, reference to his relation to David. Everybody, so in this time of Advent, so I had a few folks say, hey, why haven't we lit the tree yet? And I go, good question, because we're in a time of waiting. Because if we're going narratively about what happens before Jesus shows up, the world, it said, is drinking its tears by the bowlful. They're waiting for God to show up. Because what's happening in Israel? They're occupied by Rome. Rome has authority over them. There's some puppet king in charge, and Herod, who's not really from like the line of kings. They're disappointed. They can't be who they're meant to be. And who are they waiting for? But the offspring of the last king they had, where things were going perfectly for them as a nation. This is David. David, when we bring up David, what's the first story you think of? I say David, you say Goliath, right? Yes, that dog is great. No, we're talking about David and Goliath, the big story. That's like his most famous story because I think it's the most common one we talk about when we're preparing, when we're in Sunday school. That's the story. Every kid wants to hear a story about a kid doing something awesome. It's basically why Home Alone is such a hit. You get to see the little guy win when he shouldn't. But he does. So David is a character that we're going to talk about because what they're hoping for in a Messiah. Messiah, the word that we use for Jesus, does anyone know what that word means, Messiah? Anointed one. It's the one set apart. Jesus is going to be this new David. They're hoping for a David to show up, change the world. So what we're going to do is see if Jesus meets those David expectations. And what metrics we're going to use are Messiah expectations, whether they be political, whether they be his character expectations, or his spiritual expectations. Because David, many people will say, is the first real character in scriptures. We don't mean real like as in real life. We mean real as in lots of depth, motivation. This person makes lots of mistakes. There have been silly characters before, like Abraham, who stumbles around sometimes, but he's always just, for whatever reason, this obedient, like, you got it, God. And even when he makes a mistake, he goes, of course, God. It's not like a very real character who struggles with their motivations, who struggles with personal, like, demons. David does that. So David, we know David and Goliath. If we know David and Goliath, we know a bit about his childhood. David is the youngest of Jesse, who is a descendant of Abraham. He's got a famous family. This is the city of Bethlehem at the time is where he's from. And what's happening in the world is Israel has had judges. These are basically like tribal leaders, but they've never had a king. But Israel's growing. Israel has gone through the wilderness. They've found their place in the world. They're dealing with problems from the from who? Do you guys remember who we have as like sort of the Philistines? You guys remember these characters? They're having trouble with that, and when there's trouble, a judge would raise up, essentially a tribal leader. So your characters like Samson and stuff like that will come up and defend the people. But the people are frustrated because all around Israel are other nations. And other nations make you a little competitive, right? Like, we're the better ones. It's World Cup time. We know what that's like. They're looking at other nations and they're going, you know what sets them apart? They have a pretty predictable form of government. They don't wait around for trouble for a tribal leader to rise up and rescue them. You know what we need is a strong leader. We need a dynamic, charismatic leader. And the basically chief authority at that time is the prophets, right? The prophets are the ones who speak with God. And at this point we have Samuel, who is a great servant of God. And Samuel has heard these people and he keeps getting real frustrated. Like, man, we don't need a king because Israel has a king. Who is Israel's king? God. The whole time. Their whole identity is defined by trusting in God. The people that came out of the wilderness after the Exodus story with Moses and all this is we believe God will restore us. So we follow God. The people who show up in this land are the descendants of people that never knew slavery in Egypt. All they know is God provides for God's people. So Samuel, as the spiritual leader of this community, is going, why do you all want a king? What's the point? We know who's in charge. God's in charge. And they're like, other nations have kings. We should have a king. So Samuel is told, all right, God, the people won't shut up. They want a king. What am I to do? And God goes, they want a king. And he goes, yeah, I swear, it's just like they want some guy. And he goes, okay, I'll give you some guy. So he gives him some guy. He gives him a very tall, handsome dude named Saul. And his only prerequisites are he's tall. He's got a beard, looks very kingish. He's literally found looking for his dad's asses, is what it says. He's looking for donkeys when Samuel finds him. I'm like, perfect fit, right? He's a clueless dude who just looks like he should be in charge. Perfect. Perfect king. Because Samuel's like, yeah, maybe that's a good idea. We don't get someone with all their own. So Samuel becomes king. Samuel actually does a fine job because he just asks Saul becomes king. Saul does a pretty good job because Saul just asks Samuel, what's God want me to do? You tell me, man. We've never done this before. But over time, you can imagine that position would start to affect you. You maybe start wondering, like, how do I keep the people happy? What's something we could do? Saul has a hard time being a political leader and a spiritual leader while also maintaining his character. Because the job's going to ask some tough things of him. So one time there's this great battle or whatever, and at the end of it, God goes, look, you're defending your people, that's good. Do not steal and plunder and take all their riches. They're defeated, they're done. I don't know if you guys know politics back then, but when you conquer a nation, it costs money to conquer somebody. It helps that after the war, you get to reap all the rewards to help refill the coffers. So Saul's like, I appreciate the advice, Samuel, but I got a country to run here. And also, I've been talking to some political advisors, and it seems I need to up my kind of approval ratings around here, and I've heard statues help. Maybe one of me looking real tough, then people will know I'm tough. And he's like, okay, really? Not the point. We probably shouldn't be making big graven images of you. You shouldn't be taking money from us. You can just trust in God. And he's like, sorry, bud, you're not sitting in on the council meetings I am. There's a budget crisis. So Saul starts becoming politically what any king would be. Has to make some deals. He starts dealing with other nations, putting his trust in his partnerships. And finally, Samuel's told by God, God goes, this experiment's over. We're not doing this anymore. It's not going to work. You need a new king. And he goes, oh, Samuel's devastated. Because he really tried to help Saul. And Saul isn't a bad person. Saul's just doing the job he was given. If they want a king like any other king, he's going to behave like any other king. So Samuel's devastated, and God tells the crowd, don't worry, no need to fuss anymore. I'm going to find you a new king. This person's going to take over for him in time. You're going to go find him. He goes, oh, great. The second experiment. Let's see what big, tall idiot you're going to get this time. So he gets told, go to Jesse. Jesse has a heap of sons, bunch of them. Go there, listen to me, and I'll tell you which one to anoint, which one to pour the oil over their head, anoint them to set them apart. So he gets there, and everyone knows the story. What happens? He gets there, he sees the biggest, tallest, handsomest, strongest looking, king looking boy there and goes, yo, Jesse, is this? He's like, that's my oldest. Yes, he is a handsome, tall drink of water. And he goes, great. So and God goes, I didn't, listen. I told you, listen. You looking at which one is the most king-looking one isn't what I'm asking you to do. He goes, okay, well, what's the next one? Next one looks downright identical. He's like, clearly this will be the one. God keeps going, no. Because he keeps picking which ones, because that's been the prototype. Find the biggest, tallest one. Isn't it funny they say in political elections, it's pretty much, even in America, the taller one wins? Isn't that funny? That's in our head. Like, we need a big leader. We need a big, tall one. But that's what he's looking for. He's using his eyes. He's not listening to God. So finally, he's left with no more kids. And he goes, okay, so which one? And God's like, Jesse's son. And he goes, do you have any more sons? And they're like, we have David. And he goes, well, can you bring him out? He goes, not really. He's like he's the youngest one. Like he's the small one. He literally like, I don't know if you know, in this time, if you're the youngest born in a family, you have all of the worst jobs because you're never going to be expected to be in charge. You're never expected to run this family responsibility. Your job is a servant of the house, essentially. Not like a slave, but really you're just to your part of the inheritance, but you're never going to lead. So they're like, we have him out watching the sheep. This is where we start getting into character. The character of David is already kind of being established. If he is the youngest in his family, his whole job is, I just look after sheep, I sleep outside. If something attacks the sheep, my job is to send them off. What kind of ego do you think David possesses at this age? You think he's a pretty proud person who knows he's meant for great things? No. So character-wise, we're getting humble individual. The other thing he does is he spends so much time outside. He's kind of an artist too. He plays music. He writes poetry. I mean, seems fitting. He's like a cowboy poet. He spends all day on the range. He gets overwhelmed by the beauty of creation and has to write beautiful songs about it. He is not management material. He's an entertainer, if anything. He's just out there knowing he's going to live his life. So he's just doing his thing. So he's brought forward, and Samuel's like, this one. It's like, God's like, that's the one. So we tried big, tall, handsome, and totally clueless. Let's try a real thoughtful, humble, modest, meek, honestly, a poet. Let's try a creative type. So character we're getting right now is David the meek. He's humble. He's a poet. And he is not in leadership. He's never done this before. So in that private moment, Samuel anoints him to be the next king. What do you think David would think of this experience? This is preposterous. He has two responses. Either this means nothing, or this is Samuel. He knows something's coming for him. Something big. But in the meantime, things wouldn't change in his house. He wouldn't stop being there. He's not going to inherit his family's wealth. He's going to still be there. So what we have in David initially is this. Then we know the famous story that he gets selected because turns out he's not just a good cowboy poet. He's a great cowboy poet. He's been writing some tunes that people are talking about. They're like, have you heard Jesse's youngest son? Dude is the songbird of our generation. If you haven't picked up his album, get it ASAP, because it is touching. It can only be written by somebody who sleeps outside all day. It's really good. So much so that currently Saul is having a hard time with the responsibilities of leadership. He can't sleep. He's having the hardest time with the pressures of leadership. At this point, the Philistines have continued to attack. He's at war on multiple fronts. He is in anguish. And someone goes, bud, you know what you need? Have you heard this David? The guy is a songbird. If you get him to I heard he can play the lyre like nobody's business. Get him here. You'll go to sleep and he goes, I don't do it. Do it. He gets David there, and David's just like, ooh. And he's like, ooh. Loves it. Loves it. And he writes these beautiful music. He's like, I want him here every night, all the time. So he's basically hanging around with the king as the best musician in town. He's 13 years old, and he's just I get to hang out here as what a sweet gig. So one day, they're at the front lines of this battle, and David's trying to bring some food because his brothers are having to fight in this war against the Philistines, and we know the story. Goliath has been standing out there saying, hey, let's solve this battle. Instead of all this bloodshed, why don't we do single combat? Your best fighter versus our best fighter. Turns out it's me, 10 feet tall. I'm it. If someone can beat me, this battle's over. Spare some lives, right? Generous offer. Nobody's interested in fighting a giant. Nobody is. The guy's too big, carries like crazy armor, huge spear, big sword, all that jazz. So what happens is David hears this. David is humble, poet, not in leadership. But what does he have? He's been anointed. This guy has nothing except the memory in his youth of what? He's been marked. He will be king of Israel. When you got nothing, sometimes that faith grows in you. Because if he's got anything, he's got one thing, and it's that God has promised him something. So if God has promised him something, God, he believes, will deliver. He's already hanging out with the king. Like, this is all weirdly, like, God keeps providing for David. So David just says, I'll put him down. I'll put him down. Why? Because he thinks God absolutely will deliver him. But here's the part no one tells you. You guys ready? David has an unbelievable advantage against Goliath apart from being anointed by God. Because what has David's job been before? Shepherd, right? So we know he's got the ability of at least scaring off big beasts. He can handle himself. He's a rugged outdoorsman. Like, he is that cowboy poet that people are like, man, what a cool guy. Sings a song and also knows how to kill a bear. Like, they love him. He's like on the cover of Outdoor Magazine. Like, flannel, you know, like he's right. And he's really confident because he believes God's going to do something with him. So he does this thing where he says he wants to do this. And Saul is like, whoa. Bud, I really like the music you play, but I really would not like you getting decapitated in front of everybody by a giant. He says, so if you're going to do this, here's my armor. David says, don't even need it. No way. Why does he do this? Is it because of his unbelievable faith? Maybe. Is there an advantage to maybe fighting a 10-foot monster without armor on? What's your advantage as the little guy against a big guy? Speed, move, dip, dodge. Gives him his big spear. He's like, if I'm close enough to stab this guy with a spear, I'm ruined. That is not a good idea. And quite literally, what's his weapon of choice? He says, I know exactly what I'm going to do. He's just brought a gun to a knife fight. He's not at a disadvantage in this fight at all. A lot of people are like, wow, what courageous nature of David. David's clever. David's cunning. He goes, no, you don't fight a bear. You see a bear, you start sending rocks at it immediately. Get it out of here. I don't want one-on-one combat with a bear or a lion. He knows that with Goliath as well. I don't need to even get close to this guy. If I need armor to block a sword blow, I'm dead anyways. So David wanders into this thing, and this isn't shared in school, in Sunday school either. Does anyone know if David has a word to say before this fight? Does anyone have any idea of what he says? This guy is now also a professional wrestler, and that he has trash talking for days. David wanders out there and is like, God's going to deliver me. And God's like, child, really wouldn't do this. And he goes, oh, not only am I going to do this, I'm going to cut your head off. And he goes, because we know that's not his plan. His plan is not to get in close. But he says, no, today the Lord's going to deliver you to crows. I'm going to take your head. So are we ready? And Goliath's like, preposterous. Like, he full on calls a shot. This is Babe Ruth. Like, it's going right over there. And it's like, no way. One rock, one stone. Dude whips it in there, puts it right in his dome, which we can say could be God or absolute skill because we've already determined he's the coolest guy on earth. David is like the first superhero in the comic books. In the Bible, we've got a guy that's handsome, charming, can kill a bear, and also plays sweet music and can kill you with a stone from like 20 yards away. It's great. He's too cool. So he sinks one right in his noggin, knocks him unconscious, what does David do? I made a promise. He goes over. Does anyone remember this from Sunday school? He takes Goliath's sword and lops Goliath's head off in front of everybody. I doubt that happened in one clean swoop. That's horrifying. He gets up there and is like, everyone hear what I said I was going to do? And they're like, literally shows up in Saul's tent with it. He goes, they say, he entered his tent with the head of Goliath. So he didn't just go, hello, sir, reporting for duty. He went, bam! Ooh, who loves you, baby? This guy. I'm helping. Nobody can deny this is the coolest thing they've ever seen. Like, the coolest. After that, all of the soldiers who witnessed are like, put that kid in my division. I want him on my team. Because to them, what they're seeing is that thing that David said about who he is, which is, God will deliver me. God has set me apart for this purpose, and I can't lose. So what soldier doesn't want the guy who can't lose in their unit? Saul is now in a predicament because he doesn't just have a cool poet, famous musician in his midst. He actually now has a warrior poet in his midst that everybody wants to connect with. Because he's now like, he's gone to like legend. So that's what happens. He decides, okay, I'll do this in exchange for me like serving in your army and me defeating Goliath. Because, you know, Saul's like, this is, thank you. How do I ever repay you? He's like, let me marry your daughter. He's like, interesting choice. Just hop right into my family. The music, okay. So political, we've seen David does have a little bit of a political side to him. He believes he's going to be king. It would be helpful if not only he was a warrior and a hero, but also he was in the family. Saul's got a son, Jonathan. This will be the next king. Jonathan sees David and is like, have you ever seen anybody as cool as this kid? Like, buddy, they literally make a covenant. They make like a pact. They say, our success is bound to one another. Jonathan says, I want nothing but success for you. I want good things for you. This is a bond that David will absolutely need in the future. Because what happens is David then, in this family, starts growing in esteem. He starts being sent out on campaigns. He keeps going out there. And regardless of the challenge of the mission he's given, he always comes back flying colors. They're like, I've never seen anything like it. David's unbelievable. Saul will lead his little campaign. He'll have some victories, but he'll come back to people cheering. Have you heard what David did? And he's like, well, I won too. And they're like, oh, great. David, mind you. Everybody can't stop talking about this guy. And there's even a chant. So, you know, there's like political slogans. If there was a t-shirt at this time, there was a t-shirt going around that would have been at every Saul rally, which would say, Saul has killed his thousands. David has killed his tens of thousands. Cool rep, David. Like, I don't know how many of you have heard of David as this sort of like, not just the kid who did this and then became king, but the one who's like, honestly, a nightmare for any opponent he faces. He's literally Green Beret here. He's a SEAL. He's a ranger. He's sent on everything that's impossible. So much so that Saul starts going, it'd really be nice if he fell in battle once, maybe permanently. Because it's getting challenging that this kid's now married into his family. His own son thinks David's the coolest thing that's ever happened. And everybody who has anything to say only has words for David. He's getting paranoid. So much so one night, David's playing his music. Because David, again, this whole time, keeps posturing himself as like, I'm a servant of the one God anointed. The Lord anointed you. You're king. I serve you humbly. Good character to have. Really, it is. Like, at this point in his life, after achieving so much, do you think this has changed a bit? Probably, right? Definitely not meek. He's confident. He's confident. But if you were to ask him every time, why, how do you do it, his answer is always the same. I'm set apart, man. God did this. It's not me. It's God. I have no explanation for this, but God will deliver us. that gets people so amped about him because they're like, this guy gets it. So poet, now he's in like full leadership everywhere he goes. He's not meek. He's very like powerful, mighty, strong. It's all about killing tens of thousands of people. The guy is an expert warrior, everything. Political dynamo. Finally, one night while he's playing, Saul takes his spear in the dark and chucks it right at the sound. Because he's like, enough. It's a night terror. Ah! David dodges it and is like, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm thinking there's something bad happening here. Because Jonathan started telling him, man, my dad can't hang. He's stressed about you. He attempts it a few times, keeps sending David on impossible things, and David keeps getting out of it. And then finally one day Jonathan's like, you gotta leave. You have to leave because he's not gonna stop. He'll find a way to get you. Jonathan, David make a pact. David bounces. This is where we get the David, that again, we get this sort of like mythological thing. He's already been pretty cool of like what he did to Goliath in his battles. This is where we get David as Robin Hood. David is out in the wilderness. Do you think any of those soldiers were concerned that David was sent from the kingdom? Imagine his popularity. They're like, did you just send away our best player? How many of them do you think they're like, I'm leaving, I'm joining his team? He gets out in the wilderness and assembles quite literally a whole band, merry men. You know what I mean? Like, these are the people, these are all literal like paid fighters that are all like, I stick with David because David wins. From that we get David, the stories about him siding with the enemy, pretending he's crazy. We get all these stories of him basically spending the whole time avoiding capture of Saul while trying desperately to avoid any of his men killing Saul. Because Saul seems to be the problem for his men. So the famous story that I don't know if many people know, does anyone know about the day Saul decides he's heard rumor of where David's camping, and it's in these caves. He goes out to find David, and I wrote a whole paper on this because it's funny. I think David is Robin Hood and also Bugs Bunny. Hear me out. In Bugs Bunny, when Bugs Bunny sees Elmer Fudd, Elmer Fudd's got a gun. Do you ever get a sense that Bugs Bunny is scared? No, he always like, this maroon. Like, quite literally in the Bible, when Saul's rolling out with his force to literally hunt down and kill David, it says, David saw him from a distance. Now in Hebrew, there are words to say see, many different ways to say you saw something. You can see someone with fear, you can see someone with love, you can see somebody with anxiety. It says David just saw him. So it's David's like, well, he's doing this again. So David goes into his thing, goes into hiding, hides there. Saul can't find him. This is so funny. At the end of this, I want to show hands who knew the story before. Saul is having bathroom trouble, and he needs to find a cave to relieve himself in. So he says, everyone just stay here, watch the cave. He goes into the cave. He has just walked right into the cave where David is hiding. Goes in there, drops his britches, starts making bathroom, literally in front of David, who's like, this is Bugs Bunny stuff. He's like, at what point? I mean, really, I'm living in the wilderness because of this fool. I could very easily, it's over. I killed him. But he can't. He can't. His spiritual side is still very, very strong. He was told he's anointed. But is he to lay any hands on God's currently anointed Saul? He can't do it. He really can't. He still, regardless of his acclaim and esteem, cannot do this. He can't. He goes up behind him while he's going to the bathroom. Very Bugs Bunny. Picks up a corner of his robe, lops it off, goes back in the corner. Saul finishes his ablutions, leaves. Goes and mounts up on his horses. Now, where the heck is this David? Yoo-hoo! Is that my toilet cave? There from the toilet cave emerges David with a piece of Saul's robe and goes, you lose something? And he goes, oh my God. He had a knife right there. And David goes, I want you to remember this. I would never hurt you. Proof. I would never lay my hand on you. But you keep coming for me. I'm done with this. There's no reason for you to pursue me anymore. If you do, that's on you. That's not because I'm the problem. You're the problem. And he goes, you're right, David. Oh my gosh, I'm the pits. He leaves. He then tells his second in command, I need you to kill him because I can't do it. His second in command's like, done, gonna do it. That guy's out one time with Saul and wakes up in the morning and David's there on a hillside. Yoo-hoo! The guy goes, how is he so close all the time? David goes, hey, you're protecting Saul today, right? And he goes, yes. He goes, is Saul missing his water bottle? Is Saul missing his cloak? Is he missing some things? And he's like, were you like in there with him? And he's like, of course I am. And again, I have no desire to kill this man. Leave me out of it. And he's like, boss, I think you're right. I don't think this is really fruitful. I think this is a problem. So he's going like mad from this, all while trying to fight the Philistines. All this stuff's happening. Philistines now have welcomed David into their camp because David is like the most interesting, divisive person in their enemy's place. And David started feigning madness so he could just find some place to sleep because everyone keeps trying to kill him. David is in their camp, kind of playing spy, like messing things up for the Philistines. Well, a big fight happens between the Philistines. Saul and Jonathan are both killed in the fight. It's over. He's dead. The Philistines that were there then take his crown, his little gauntlets, his little scepter. They pile it all up and they're like, I know somebody's going to want this. Even the Philistines know them to talk. They show up to David and go, he's done. What's David's response if he's this like faithful character person? Is it, yes, time to go home? He's devastated. That's what they say. I still think it's interesting that they brought this stuff to him. Makes it seem like maybe he was fine with this. But he kills the dudes who killed Jonathan and Saul. He kills them. He's like, how dare you hurt God's anointed? However, I will take this stuff. Thank you. He goes home. He's returned. He's welcomed as a king. After this point, David rules as king for a long time. We get the first big Bathsheba Gate controversy in his first term. While he's there, some things start changing about his character because David has stopped being the Robin Hood. David stopped being Bugs Bunny. He's the boss. Like, he gets all this. His character is challenged by this. One of those things is, if he's the coolest man in town, why can't he just bed anybody he wants? And he does. Not okay. After this happens, what happens is, do we know the Bathsheba story? Sees a woman bathing. This time he's kind of having a crisis in his life because Samuel, the one who anointed him, is dead. He's missing that sort of spiritual guidance. Some would say this is why he sort of fell off. He wasn't just the warrior king poet anymore. He was now sort of wandering in his faith, his commitment to God. He remembered who he was, but he had a hard time living it out. So he makes this mistake. We get the prophet Nathan telling him, Bud, this is a sin that's not going to go over well, that you did this. You killed Uriah so that you could have Bathsheba. Your son's going to perish. In fact, you're going to have a really hard time with your family. The story going forward, I can't fit into this one, but what happens to David essentially is his family falls to rancor. Like, it's a disaster. He is a really faithful person, but he's struggling just like Saul before him to be a king and to be a servant of God. His kids want to be in charge. His kids want the throne. Do you think his kids followed any of this? Of the previous David? No, they're nothing like David. They're born into royalty. They're set apart. They're special. They're spectacular. They're going to be kings. They fight with each other. They kill each other. David at one point is even sent out of his own kingdom by his son, who's like, it's done. I'm in charge. Absalom says, I'm now the king. Leave. Even marries David's concubines. Starts saying, no, they're my wives now. Terrible. Terrible. His family falls apart. He has the then poetry that you can read in Psalms of, I'm crushed. God, I need you to remake me. Psalm 52, I think. You need to remake me because I am ruined. I don't know what's wrong with me, but the only thing that can fix it is for you to undo me entirely and make me again. By the end of his life, there's a ton of humility in David, to the point where he even says, like, I don't want to build a temple. I just want to worship God. I don't want anything. I have his last thing he says about his son. When his son takes over, we get does anyone remember the king that comes after him, the wise one, cutting babies into? Solomon, right? He has this really great quote where he says, to his son, David now, minus all his hubris, his lust, his insecurities, his self-ambition, he says to Solomon what a good king could be. This is where the story kind of comes back around to the shepherd David. David, at the end of his life, kind of returns to the one he was at the beginning of his life and says, when one rules justly over men, he says this to Solomon, he says, ruling in fear of God, so not in your own ambition. He dawns on them like the morning light, like sun shining forth on a cloudless morning, like rain that makes grass sprout from the earth. That description of what a good king is looks so different from what David was, which was this incredibly, by world standards, one of the greatest kings. It is the greatest king of Israel, easily. After his rule, the kingdom splits in two. After his rule, they're carried off into exile. There's so much trauma that comes from his leadership. But what's wild is the idea of Messiah is reformed while they're in exile, while the people are lost, without their home, without their kingdom, without their temple, without anything like that. They're looking for what? David. If we could just have our stuff back. David couldn't lose, so we couldn't lose. David always won, so we won. David expanded the kingdom. We were ever expanding. All they want is David. So when Jesus is getting his reputation that we see about him, we know the little similarities he has to David. Where is Jesus born? In the same town David was from. That's great. What's the lineage of his father Joseph? He's a descendant of Jesse. He's literally a son of David. So Jesus fits these like very analytical, like if you had to have check boxes, he starts checking some boxes very early on. Jesus would have been born into very modest upbringing. By no means is Jesus like a high household, like expected of great things. He's actually born into a pretty challenging situation where he's immediately has to be whisked off to Egypt as a refugee. We're getting these sort of like early David things. He fits it so much. Where Jesus fulfills then what David hopes a good king would be, that the dawn would shine on them, that they grow like this. All these beautiful images. But where Jesus ticks all the boxes is young David or old David. In the middle is what the expectations are. Political expectations of Messiah is what? Not young David, not old man David whose family is falling apart. They want David who kills, David who dominates, David who wins, David who can dance naked through the street. He's such a celebrity that people go, wow, what a faithful guy. Like they want charismatic David who can't lose. We know the statue, the David. A perfect physical specimen. What a handsome rock star on the cover of the Outdoor magazine. They're hoping Jesus, the expectation for Messiah is politically a dominant, charismatic force. Does Jesus show up in Jerusalem? What happens? People start waving palms. Everywhere he goes, they say, there's something about him. He speaks with a certain authority that nobody else does. What is it about him? He's got a piece of this charisma, this energy. But politically speaking, at what point is he saying it's time to take the hill? It's time for us to take the throne. It's time for me to conquer the so-and-sos, marry the wife of blah, 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 so that we can have good relationships with their nation. Jesus does not seem to have political aspirations unless we're talking about the kingdom. The kingdom, God's reign, which was young David's idea. was never that he was king, but that God was. God will deliver him. Character-wise, does he reflect David? At some points in David's life, I'd say they're very similar. David, who's willing to say, I really do believe God's going to deliver me through this guy, Goliath. It's nearly identical. In fact, character of David, who's been sent out of his home, when he had to leave the palace, when his son sent him out, he was defeated. He went away. Do you know which way he left out of the palace? He went to the Mount of Olives and wept. He wept there and was like, if this is your will, God, I get it. I've made a lot of mistakes, and I'm paying for this. I just pray that my son won't be hurt in this. Jesus is the exact same thing. Shows up in that Mount of Olives going, I know what's coming's bad, and I need you, if it's your will that it not go this way, good. I hope it isn't, but I'm ready to do this. Character-wise, tons of similarities, except when we're talking about the one of expectations, which is that his character would be a decisive warrior. Kill the enemies. Spiritual, same thing. Young David, absolutely. An abiding love and trust in God, that God will deliver. But the David we get later is a spiritual one who's trying to make all these deals like, please, God, he's trying to make negotiations to maintain all that he has. Whereas Jesus seems to be about letting go of all that he's been given for the sake of the world. We get a perfection of the king in Jesus. We had a great model, and that's where when you wonder why the people could cheer when Jesus showed up and then say crucify him within a few days, it's the expectations that the Messiah is David. This guy don't look like David, even though he really does. He just looks like a different kind of David. A David that existed, but a David that was corrupted by this world's narrative. David, as we know, hides from Saul in the wilderness. Jesus walks headfirst into Jerusalem. There is a very different character in these two, despite their similarities, which is why when we're praying for this root of Jesse in Christmas and Advent, as we're leading up to, what we're asking for is that perfection of what started in David, which was a promise that God's going to deliver God's people, that we would have this king, this fantastic king, a perfect king. And the perfect king is not found in this strength, charisma, everything we hope a king would be. It's found in this servant's heart, the strange identity of this wandering, itinerant preacher who's also a construction worker. So as you guys this week, next week, leading up to Christmas, when you're hearing these things, I hope you guys hear whenever there's a David reference, we can put that sort of into context as we hear what God's doing here is an elevation, a perfection of David in the life of Jesus Christ. And then we're called to imitate that as well. That same sort of abiding trust, hope, optimism, enthusiasm for the Spirit, but also one that's not about serving ourselves. A line I heard the other day was, God has all sorts of hopes for the church, but it's not that we be big and classically successful. That's a very David mindset. The church, God hopes, is going to restore the world to grace, to peace. We are to be this expression, a reflection of this type of Messiah versus this type of Messiah. Good, something we expect and hope for, but we got something else, and that's actually better, despite the challenges that comes with it. That's all I got. That's most of David's story. I couldn't go through all of it, because it is a short thing. When they said, hey, did you talk about David? I go, I've talked about David for 3 weeks, but this is our main one. Comments, questions, or concerns?
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
You mentioned that David's house was a mess and everything, but there still was lineage and family.
Yes, his house was a mess in terms of leadership. Nobody ever captured David's style, his vibe, because nobody could care. No offense to Solomon, who was, and many people would say, was just so, that's his thing, is he was wise, right? Solomon was wise, didn't meet those expectations politically. That guy was smart. He ran a good kingdom. He also, though, built the temple, which David didn't do, because David's I don't know if we should put God inside of a big stone building, since the God we worship is the one who guided us through the wilderness from a tent. Why would I build this? He thought about it, but he was humbled to, maybe I'm not going to build that. Solomon's first thing is I'm going to honor my dad's big dream and build a big castle to put God in. And everyone's woo! Solomon's smart. That really does get the people riled up. Like, we built the God house. God lives in our town. Like, that's smart politically. Spiritually, that was a complete fundamental misunderstanding of God's character that even David, in his old age, was like, I think building a temple is more about my ambition than about God's want. Which Jesus literally says when he sees the temple. This is all coming down. And that's okay, because God doesn't just dwell here. There's another little David-Jesus similarity, one that's kind of hidden in there. Neither of them were like, I don't know if a big God house is the answer to this. Yeah.
Is this a story about the Jewish religion?
It's a story about a prolific character in it.
But it's about God's people at the time, right?
Yes.
Which were the Jews.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, Hebrew people.
So how do we get from there to here?
What we have here?
Yeah.
Jesus.
I understand that Jesus was a Jew.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's another class. That was actually my undergrad was in Hebrew, Judaic studies, Hebrew scriptures. So I learned Hebrew and stuff like that. My thesis was on honors thesis that I didn't end up writing because the professor who was my chair invited me to go to Israel, and I was like, skip it. I'll just go to Israel. I'm not going to write this. But I had done all the research for the thing, which was that over time the Jewishness of Jesus was removed. They took away that sort of identity that he was rooted. It's for me. You'll notice I love talking about the Old Testament and Old Testament stories because it's what Jesus taught. He didn't teach the New Testament. He taught what we read in the New Testament. He was the New Testament. But I don't like the idea of calling Old Testament Old Testament. I call them Hebrew scriptures because they are the words Jesus would have loved and found grace and mercy, that God's story of hope and expectations can be found in the Old Testament ain't old. It's really, really profound. And old. How that happened, it would be a whole other class, but it would be a whole lot about kind of hijacking elements of it for people that they'd be more agreeable to them. Losing a lot of his Hebrew character. But I'd argue it's not lost. It's just overlooked. And I think sometimes it's on purpose. As we know with anti-Semitism, that was especially our tradition. I'll say, this is my disclaimer as us as Lutherans, being German, rooted from that movement, Luther in his old age grew very anti-Semitic. He started as thinking what he was doing was about like kind of unfolding this so that you'd see the Jewishness of Jesus. In fact, one time when he was called a heretic, he says, when you get done calling me a heretic, I would appreciate it if you started calling me a Jew, because they're great. They understand. He thought that was going to do him a lot more favors in terms of like converting people to his way. Well, it didn't, because Judaism isn't about conversion. It's about obedience to this way. I'm not going to change anything for anything. It's going to be the way, the long obedience in this tradition of restoring the world. So we as Lutherans have to deal with the fact that historically a lot of our heritage, I'll say cultural Christianity version of Lutheranism, has done a lot of harm to Jewish people. Because Hitler even was like, see, Luther hated him too. It's like, when he was old and weird, yes, he did. Sad thing.
Yeah, but I mean, it started even before that.
Oh, way before that, yeah.
It was just a continuation in a different view.
And I would say before, even in this time, before that, the story of the Hebrew people is about like their management to, why they exist is wild. Historically, it's like insurmountable what odds they've overcome that their scriptures have remained intact. I would argue it's because they're literally designed to be a bubble by the Old Testament, by their traditions. People wonder, what about the observances of Judaism? Aren't they so rote? I'm like, no, they preserve them. They keep them. It's not about pleasing God with their observances. It's about keeping themselves right. So they persist through multiple exoduses, getting cast out, getting absorbed, diasporas, and they still always exist afterwards because they're bound by their identity, which is not just a religion, it's a way. It's their family. They're people, they're not a religion. Any other comments? Yes?
Just one question. You said Saul grew suspicious of David, to the point where he wanted to kill. Well, sort of an inkling that David had been anointed?
Yes, I think he did. It was said it was done in secret, but my guess is that secret's not kept well. Saul knew it was up, especially when Jonathan's kind of like deferred. He's like, David's way great. It's like, son, you're supposed to take the job. He's like, I'd give it to David. He's like, this is deranged, man. They're going to cut your head off. Like, that's not how this works. He's playing Game of Thrones, you know. The other one's playing like Lord of the Rings. So one of them's like, can I sing a song about how nice these potatoes are? The other one's like, you have to kill him or you're going to get killed. Yeah, Saul knew what was up, I think. It's not like explicitly there, but I think what he knows from Jonathan and apart from his anointing in general, he's going to be king. Like, listen to the people. It's not like there's a long heritage of kings before Saul. He's like, we're ruined already. I got one person from my line. All right, if anyone's in at 11, you got to run. But if anyone would like to hang around, I'm here. I don't have to go anywhere.
Thank you.
Go team.
Thank you. Thanks.